Hi everyone, we're back. Welcome back to Hack.Summit. And we are privileged and blessed to be here by Ryan Bubinski, who is the co-founder and CTO of Codecademy. Now Ryan was generous enough to give us some of his time today. So for the next hour we'll be chatting with him. He's going to be delivering a presentation. He's also the founder of the Application Development Initiative at Columbia University. And he built the original platform for Codecademy and scaled it to its current version. So he's in the trenches, coding, managing development team. He's in the real world, and he has lots of words of wisdom to impart to you today. I couldn't be happier having him here today. Ryan, feel free to take it away, and I'll be back later to chat. The audience member that asks the most interesting question, as voted by other audience members, will receive 1 hour of free mentoring from the speaker that's participating of that audience member's choice. So ask interesting questions. We'll be conducting polls throughout Ryan's presentation as well, so we'll find out some interesting facts about you as well. So Ryan, go ahead and take it away whenever you're ready.
Ed, thank you very much for that introduction. Hello to the internet. I think this is really incredible. This is the first time I've ever participated in a conference like this, but it's just such an incredible platform to talk to so many people from all over the world who, for whatever reason, I would not get to meet. So I'm incredibly excited to be speaking with all of you here today. I've got a chat window on the right, so I'm seeing what you're writing. We've got Q&A for the end of the talk, but for the bulk of time that we have together today, I actually wanted to go over a topic that I was kind of racking my head, and I was saying, okay, well, who am I going to be speaking to today, and what could maybe be the most useful piece of advice that I would have loved to hear before starting out on this journey of building web applications of all shapes and sizes and scales, ultimately starting a company and growing that team to 20 people. And as I kind of worked my way through the different topics that I could talk about, the one that I ultimately landed on was how to make technical decisions. It's a topic that, as an engineer or a developer, you're going to encounter this, this challenge at every step of the way. And it can be a very unwieldy topic, so I wanted to scope it to how to choose framework. There's a case study that I want to walk you through from a recent technical decision that we made here at Codecademy. And with that, I'm going to share my screen. We've got a little bit of a wonky setup here, so hopefully you can all see okay. If you can't, HackHands has an amazing technical team on the back end that'll let me know, and we'll get this set up. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, and we can get started with the presentation. All right, I think.
Ryan, that looks great. I can see it.
Awesome. Great. So like I said, today I wanted to walk through my thoughts on how to go about choosing a front-end framework, and as a larger topic of discussion, implications or what that might mean for approaching technical decisions at large. So, Ed, thank you for that great introduction. I was really excited to hear about your shout-out, not just for Codecademy, but also for the Application Development Initiative. I'm sure that none of you would probably know this, but before starting Codecademy, I actually spent 3 years in college building up a community for people to teach each other programming, and that was my first effort to bring people together, just to teach each other really cool things you could do with code, and that was a great start. There was only so much we could do with that community because it was limited to the people who went to my college and who were in the nearby area. And it was through technology that ultimately, and then through Codecademy, that I was able to reach a much larger audience. And I see this event today as a perfect example of how technology allows for community to develop from all over the world. I'm looking at the chat window here, and just in the last 20, I'm seeing people from Algeria and London and Poland and the Philippines, Serbia, and I just can't express how amazing that is to me. So thank you for joining today. Just to set some expectations, I think when everyone talks about choosing a front-end framework, that can immediately start to trigger dogmatic tendencies. I'm not going to be focusing so much on trying to suggest what framework you should use, or necessarily what is the best framework ever, or is necessarily Angular better than Backbone, or is Ember better than React? All of these questions are very contextual. And so what I do want to try to answer today is, first for Codecademy, what was the right framework for us to be using? And how, from this experience, can we hopefully find an effective, efficient, and repeatable way of going about to make technical decisions? So, real quick, what I wanted to walk you guys through today is about 3 months ago, the engineering team at Codecademy had a decision to make. And that decision was, what front-end framework should we use going forward? And I want to take you through that technical decision in 3 different parts. How we set up the decision, how we went about informing the decision and looking at all the different options that we could take, and ultimately making the decision, and then seeing, hey, were we right here, and did we hope to avoid all of the pitfalls and all of the risks that we had highlighted along the way. So with that, let's get started. The first of the 3, setting up the decision. First, you have to define actually what is the decision that has to be made. This is, this seems like the most obvious point. Probably it is. It's simple, but it can very easily be overlooked. As you can tell, I was writing this over lunch today, so of course I was thinking to myself, well, I have a decision right now to make. What do I want to eat today? And it turns out that it's not always so easy. I'm very fortunate to have plenty of options. Not everyone is, but I had a decision to make. So I defined it. It was, what do I want to eat today? Next, you have to determine, given this decision that you have to make, what are the risks of making a poor decision? Not every decision is equal. Choosing between maybe what do I want to eat today and who do I want to spend the rest of my life with have very, very different risks associated with them, and should probably not be approached in the same way. So we need to pick a process that's appropriate for the risk of the decision. There are many, many ways to make a decision. As you probably think to yourself, how have I gone about making decisions in my own life? It can get a little unwieldy, everything from a magic 8-ball to an incredibly elaborate process with 20 steps. At some point you might even ask yourself, do we need a decision process for choosing our decision process? Hopefully not in this case, but these are the first 3 steps I would claim for setting up a decision that are incredibly important. So let's look at defining the decision that we have to make, highlighting the risk of making a poor decision, and choosing a process to run to make that decision. So now I'm going to dive into the specifics of Codecademy for this first part, and this is going to be a common format throughout the talk. I'm going to kind of go over high level, what are the themes or the key ideas, and then I'm going to discuss how they applied to the decision that we had to make here, which is what framework do we use going forward, specifically front-end framework. So real quick context, if you're not already familiar with Codecademy, it is a way of learning to code for free online for anyone all over the world, no matter where you're accessing the internet from. And it's an entirely interactive, immersive education experience. So this was our learning environment about 3 months ago. It had grown in complexity from very humble beginnings 2 years ago to one that actually came very, very close to being a full-featured IDE. We wanted to jump from just teaching simple languages to teaching how many languages come together to build a full application. So this is an example of the new learning environment. We chose Front-End Web Framework to build this out, and this is a front-end framework which is incredibly more expansive and flexible than the earlier one. Here you can see an example where we're teaching within the Rails web application framework how to set up initial fixtures or entries in a database, and we give you full access to a terminal and a web editor. But this same learning environment can also present multimedia, or in this case, just a simple image explaining the request-response cycle within the view and the control over framework, as well as showing you exactly what your application looks like in real time within a browser widget. So this was an incredibly complex, rich UI that was going well beyond what our initial framework could do, and we wanted to make sure we picked the right tool for the job. So we had to decide what would be the right framework for us to use. Now, there's also some historical context, and anytime you go into making a decision, it's important to know from what position are you making that decision? So if you guys are curious, if you kind of want to know how our front-end tech stack has evolved over the years, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but this is a good quick overview. When we first launched, we had a monolithic global application.js file. So I'm going to take a quick break here because I think people are saying they can't read. So I'm just going to go ahead and do full screen present. Hopefully this helps. So
looks beautiful, Ryan. Looks great.
Great. So this means I can't read the chat window. So I'm going to be a little bit less responsive to your questions. But Ed or Forrest from HackHands, if you guys can chime in if there's a really good question, I'd be happy to pause. So
you got it, buddy.
Thank you. To jump right back into it, so real quick context, in late 2011, we had this single application.js file. This was right around the time when robust front-end MVC frameworks, or at least model and controller frameworks, were coming out. Backbone was still pre-1.0. So we still had, a single monolithic application.js file. Early 2012, we made the switch to Backbone.js for our model and our controller, and we were using Mustache for our templates. We've continued to use this up until 3 months ago. This was the point that we wanted to take a step back and make a decision. Should we keep going with this, or should we choose something new? Our biggest pain point for us was state passing between the controller and the view was really becoming a nightmare. We had adopted this mediator design pattern, and we were writing mediators for almost every coupling, and it was too tightly coupled. It was really difficult to make a change, and tech debt was growing really quickly. So in mid-2014, we had to ask ourselves, do we want to continue with the same old, or do we want to do something new? And what was really interesting is over these years, actually, I want to give some context. Maybe some of you have read this blog post, but I want to bring your attention to it because I think it does a great job of encapsulating kind of the zeitgeist of JavaScript frameworks today. And the summary of this post by Breck Mackay, The State of JavaScript in 2015, it's forward-looking, and his conclusion is that frameworks may not always be the right metaphor for front-end development. He does a nice job of, it's an opinionated piece, of course, but he does a nice job of kind of walking through the consequences of this churn rate and proliferation of front-end JavaScript technologies. It's incredible that we have such choice when it comes to choosing a front-end framework. It's incredible that there's so many offerings. We're seeing that with fragmentation comes specialization, and with specialization, it might be time to switch away from this idea of a monolithic framework and to favor libraries that work together in a complementary way. And as a spoiler alert, we actually ended up using React.js, which calls itself a library, not a framework. So I do want to highlight that, yes, I'm titling this talk How to Choose a Framework, but that's not always the right metaphor. So that is quick context for kind of defining what decision did we have to make. And now to talk a little bit about the risks of making a poor decision. Picking the wrong framework, if you're just a single individual, does not have the same risks. If you're working on a side project or you're just trying something new, that has a much lower risk than choosing a framework for a production level piece of software that's used by millions of people every day. We're picking a tool here that are going to be used by engineers on the team every day for many years. And picking the wrong framework could be disastrous for our ability to ship product. It could be disastrous for the productivity of our engineers and just for everyone's general happiness. You pick the wrong tool for the job and you're stuck with it, not a good situation to be in. And so the last step was for us to pick a decision-making framework. This was the trickiest part for us because, like I mentioned, there's many, many ways to make a decision. We've come here at Codecademy to adopt one that I call the DRI framework. It's just a simple acronym, but it's pretty straightforward. I want to walk through it because it's a good encapsulation of the rest of my talk. You mentioned, if you recall, I mentioned earlier, step of setting up the decision, informing the decision, and then making the decision. And those 3 steps are carried out by 3 roles if you were to adopt this framework. There's one and only one decider. I think it's incredibly important for one person to have accountability in a decision. There's a recommender, This is one and only one person who is responsible for collecting all the input and formalizing that in a recommendation. They're doing the bulk of the work. And then there's inputters. And so this is the opportunity for everyone who's going to be affected by this decision in a structured, constructive way to have an impact on it. So first, the decider and the recommender agree on the criteria for the decision. This is what we'll talk about next. What were the criteria for our decision, and what can that mean for a decision at large? Inputters work with the recommender to inform the decision, and they iterate upon the criteria based upon their research. The criteria you pick up front may not be the right ones later on. And then the recommender makes a recommendation for a decision based upon that input, and then ultimately the decider either picks the recommendation that's being made, or the decider has the responsibility of offering criteria to suggest a different recommendation outcome. So as a quick overview, what does this look like in practice? Here's just a simple scenario to kind of walk you through what this might mean. Let's say there's Sue. Sue's the decider. We have John. John's the recommender. And then we have all the other engineers who might be affected by this decision as inputters. All three of these people ideally are domain experts or are clearly aware of the consequences of the decision. So Sue and John, as the decider and the recommender, agree on the criteria for the framework that they want to be using. And so I'll talk about what that means for Codecademy next, but as a next step, John and other engineers, as inputters, will look at all the different framework candidates that might be out there, all the different libraries that are out there, and then they'll compare them against the criteria that they picked. And they'll start to work through the different options until they get to a point where John feels like he can make a recommendation, at which point Sue either accepts, and hopefully accepts, because they're in full agreement on the relevant criteria. It is important in this process for the decider to be able to reject a recommendation, but that's pretty much a safety measure. In almost all cases, if this process is run correctly, the decider will accept the recommendation. This is actually based off Bain's rapid model for decision making. If you are all interested in how large companies make decisions, this is, in my opinion, significant overkill for a team of Codecademy size, but the idea is that this is a model that can scale regardless of this, the risk at hand for the decision, the number of people that are involved. So what does this all mean in practice? Well, I want to talk about how we go about informing the decision. So this is the real meat of the conversation. I want to get into what were the criteria that really mattered to us when choosing a framework. And I think this is probably the part that's relevant to the majority of the audience. So first, we do have to pick some criteria that we care about. If you think about all of the possible frameworks you could be working with, before you pick a criteria, it's really a big pile of different acronyms and confusing topics. And ideally, we start to define, through our criteria, the outline of how we're going to organize all of this. And as we start to iterate on this, hopefully we're going to start to see how this big mess of tools organizes itself into hopefully a really clear kind of landscape, different options, and there'll be a really, really clear winner. Either the tool might not exist, in which case some companies make the decision to build, and if it does exist, companies will make the decision to buy. And when I mean buy, when I say buy, I mean either using an open source framework, because you're still paying in the sense that you're paying developers to implement that open source project internally, or you actually pay either a per seat license or a one-time. So, what did this mean for us? So when we first started out, turns out that there are a bunch of well-formed and well-based opinions on the criteria for choosing a JavaScript framework. In fact, there are 56 million ways to pick criteria. So it's not necessarily an obvious answer. It's not like there's just one or two steadfast ways. And in fact, whenever it comes to picking the criteria for decision, this is going to be the most contextual part of the problem, meaning what's going to matter most is what are the important criteria for your problem, as opposed to what are the best universal criteria. For us, we boiled it down to three things. We wanted to answer what was the experience like for us as engineers when creating a mock implementation, creating a stub of the ultimate UI that we wanted to build. What was the estimated strength of the community for the tools that we were looking at? And what was the appropriateness of the tool for our use cases? So I'm going to go into each of these in detail. By mocking the implementation, I really recommend if you're going to be working with a tool for any length of time, take it for a test drive. You wouldn't buy a car without driving it first, and I recommend that you don't pick a framework without at least trying to build something with it. It's really important, I think, not to get too carried away because it's possible for a mock to turn into the actual implementation. We tried to not invest more than an hour or two in order to get a feel for what we were working with. In some cases, that's not always possible. Not all tools have the same setup time. Not all tools are as easy to use as others. So you just really have to take that into context. This is just one thing informing the decision. And on kind of the micro scale, for us, we actually compared what would it mean to render a component across all the different frameworks. So we were looking at, for every single framework that we were considering, what was kind of the minimum boilerplate code that we'd have to write just to get our component rendered. In some cases, it was a single class attribute on HTML. In others, it was about 20 lines of code. So, very different use cases, very different architectural decisions. I think it's good to look at the macro and the micro here. On trying to assess the strength of the community, I think there are many, many different ways of doing this. These are the 3 ways of assessing the strength of an open source community that we ultimately chose to focus on. Any kind of Google search on how to assess the strength of an open source community, you're guaranteed to get a ton of opinions. There's many ways to slice it. For us, we cared about 3 things. We cared about momentum, because where a project is today does not mean where it's going to be a year from now. We cared about momentum, adoption momentum across developers, and we cared about momentum of developers on the open source project. And the third option that we cared about for assessing the strength of the community was the quality and volume of relevant code examples. So all 3 of these we had pretty clear metrics for every framework that we were trying to assess. We looked at those ubiquitous Google Trend charts. Anytime you do a comparison in Google Trends between Angular, Ember, or Backbone, it's just one more data point. It's not the end-all be-all, but it's interesting. On development momentum, we looked at the number and the volume of contributors for each project, and we looked at the quality of their contributions, both by volume but also by consistency and relevancy. Fortunately, because of both GitHub and, well, less so now, Google Code, all of this information is available in public. Take the time to truly look at the development momentum of a project before you make a high-cost or a high-risk decision to adopt it. And the third one, quality of code examples. First of all, do they exist? Are they up to date? I think this is a great proxy for dedication of the open source contributors to their platform and to helping spread adoption across the larger development ecosystem. And for use case criteria, this is the most contextually sensitive. For us, we had 6 really, really important attributes that we cared about. So we were looking at, across all frameworks, pretty much in a prioritized order, would it work with our current web application framework? We use Rails for our full stack development. We wanted a front-end framework that would be compatible with that. Not all of them are. That's totally fine. That's an architectural decision. But for us, it was incredibly important. SEO compatibility is also incredibly important. Not all front-end frameworks are SEO compatible. And performance. Performance is maybe the trickiest to define, and it's really hard, I think, to have a really good understanding of performance before you've seen your application perform in the wild. Because more often than not, there's so many things that you can look at when it comes to performance. It's incredibly important to first profile and see how your application is doing to date, what matters to your end users, how are they experiencing performance, and then to translate that into the most relevant criteria. For us, it meant the responsiveness of the UI, how well the framework handled memory performance, and overall render times. Those were the 3 main performance criteria that we looked at for defining a snappy, responsive web experience that could handle a web application that was as complex as ours. The last 3, this really came down to us feeling like this was the right tool for the job. Was it architected with our use case in mind? As an added bonus, the last 2 were kind of nice to haves. Did we already have team experience with this framework? And what was the end user footprint size? We already have a very large asset footprint. As you can imagine, if we're trying to serve up something just short of a full IDE, there's going to be a lot of code that's involved. Of course, we didn't want to double or triple that footprint size with the framework that we were choosing. It's relevant, but in most cases, it wasn't a major issue for us. It might be a major issue for you, for like I said, these use case criteria are incredibly context dependent. And then, this was really the meat of it, where I didn't want to get into this in too much detail because there's a lot of our own opinions in here, and that's not what this talk's so much about, as opposed to the larger framework in which we made this decision. But for each of the candidates that we were looking at, we wanted to assess them against each of these criteria in as well-informed a way as possible. If there was an article out there, we'd try to find it. If there was any kind of data attribute there, we would record it. And if there was a trend, even better. And then we'd put all of that together in one place. And this made it much easier to kind of get a full view of the problem. I think so often technical decisions are made by omission or default, or aren't necessarily fully researched. This is a critical step of just going through the motions, filling out your matrix, and truly saying, we've done our homework. We're at least going into this with some information, maybe not full information. We know what we're getting into. And this kind of becomes the real working document for the inputters and the recommender in the process. And it's through this document they're forcing themselves to ask, do our criteria matter? How do our candidates compare against this criteria? And are we looking at the right options? So once you get this document together, hopefully you're in a really solid place to make the decision. And normally this is the hard part, but in my opinion, the beauty of this framework is that making the decision is hopefully the easiest part. Once you've done all of the hard work of setting it up correctly, ideally, the hard part of this is that you have to put together a recommendation. The whole point of going through that process of defining your criteria, collecting your input, and having those hard conversations to literally get on that same page or that same spreadsheet is that you start to form opinions on what the recommendation should be. And the recommender can put together a formal recommendation based upon that input criteria. Now, assuming that the decider has been fully involved and aware of how these criteria are evolving and has full buy-in to those criteria, it should be almost a default yes to accepting that recommendation, because the point of the decider is to take on the responsibility ultimately of making the decision, to kind of let everyone else who's involved do the hard work and be creative and go far and wide in answering, well, what's possible here. At the end of the day, though, there's a single point of accountability for making sure that the decision's made and there's accountability for that decision. The recommender ends up getting, hopefully, most of the credit, and the decider can take that responsibility. Now, when I say that the recommender writes up a recommendation, I mean that they're writing up this might just be a one-page report, it might be a two-page report, but they're writing up an actual report. And I know engineers hate writing in most cases, and certainly not in all, not to generalize, but why write English when I could be writing code, or why write whatever language you speak? And I'm going to really harp on this point. I think when you're making a decision that involves 3 or more people, and you deem that decision to be of a high enough risk for making a poor decision that it's worth running a process like this, as opposed to just chatting it out or just picking something in 5 minutes, it's worth taking the time at the end of this to write it up. 3 simple reasons. I think writing is an incredible tool to force you to make a cogent, well thought out argument. Persuading with speech is nowhere near as complex, or it's just easier to manipulate through rhetoric. But if you have to write something up, it's much easier to challenge really the credibility of that argument. Second, documents create transparency in the decision-making process if they're writing about the right thing. And what I mean by the right thing is how we came about to make the decision, what informed it, what did we care about, and what's fantastic about a written document is it's infinitely scalable, just like software. Write it once, share it anywhere. You can share it with anyone who's affected by the decision. You can share it with anyone who's interested in the decision. And I'm sure if you've worked in a team of more than 3 or more people, you learn very quickly that communication's hard, right? In any network, if you have node-to-node communications, the complexity of that is exponential. So it's nice to have a document highlighting the process that is scalable and shareable. And it also is invaluable in sharing across time. It becomes an incredibly important piece of institutional memory. If a year from now we're cursing the decision that we made and we're wondering how someone could be so dense as to choose what we chose, we have a very clear argument that at least highlights the assumptions that we went into the process with. So we're not at least starting over. We're starting from where we left off. So for us, what did this mean? This is kind of like the big ta-da. If you guys have been wondering, I had a spoiler early on of what our ultimate decision was. But in our write-up, this is a real quick summary of what we chose. It's just to give you kind of a flavor of how we think about writing up our decision documents. But the decision was to use Backbone.js, which we were already using, as you knew, for our model and our controller logic, and to use React for our view logic on top of that, especially because of its focus on just handling the view side of the logic of front-end application development, and in its philosophy around data flow that makes coupling between events and render updates much simpler than with other frameworks. And just to highlight kind of how our criteria evolved over the process, there were 3 main criteria for us that really made React stand out above, heads and shoulders above the competition. So the first was the ability to render server-side, both for SEO and for faster response times. That does not come out of the box. For us, we have to run a dedicated node server to handle that, but it is in no way overly complex to set up, and it's a significant advantage over other frameworks where that's either not possible or far more difficult to do. Choosing React gave us the ability to maintain code with our current approach using Backbone for the kind of heavy lifting of the model and the controller logic. It was not possible with more opinionated, more monolithic frameworks where we would have to throw out a lot of logic that we had heavily invested in or just like flat up rewrite things. And the third was this flexibility, or this freedom from being tied down from a single style of convention that would be difficult to integrate with our existing convention. So an opinionated framework can be fantastic if you're just starting out. It can be fantastic for someone who doesn't want to have to worry about making decisions at the architecture level, but wants to worry about making decisions about their application. For us, we'd already done a lot of that heavy lifting. We were looking for less of a framework and more of a library, as I kind of pointed out earlier. So this is kind of how we come full circle in this talk for some of our key takeaways. At the end of the day, it's incredibly contextual. In our case, we were looking for the right, for a round peg, the round hole, and that's really what a decision-making process is about. Do you find not the best answer ever, but do you find the best answer for the problem that you have? So the results, we're 3 months out here. I polled my team today, and I truly believe this reflects their opinions of the process and my own opinions of the process. But how do I think we made the right decision? Absolutely. Why? Well, devs are happy. I mean, happy not just about working with a tool that they enjoy and they feel like it's the right tool for the job, but I think even more importantly, engineers feel empowered to make and inform decisions that directly impact them and their work. So often you get into situations where, I even like the talk before, if you happen to join that, they were talking about antagonistic relationships between managers and engineers. I truly believe that this is just one example of a process to have a more collaborative relationship between everyone on the team based upon roles. I'd say the entire team is happy. A happy team is a team that ships product on time. And we're working on top of this platform to build future iterations of the product and to bring even better features to our users. And I'm happy because well, everyone else is happy, and if everyone else is happy, I'm happy. So I want to give a real quick summary, and then we can jump into Q&A and see where we're at on that front. But in summary, we've talked about 3 main steps here. First, make sure that you're setting up the decision for success. Clearly define the decision you need to make. Weigh the risks of that decision. Not all decisions have equal risks, clearly. For higher risk decisions, run a process. Maybe it's one like the DRI process I just went over. Maybe it's something totally different. Then inform the decision. Pick criteria based upon input from everyone involved. In this case, the roles of the decider, the recommender, and inputters. The recommenders and the inputters get to work comparing candidates for the decision against these criteria. And all along the way, the decider, the D, is giving input on criteria as well, so that come time to make a decision, there's a clear understanding of the relevant criteria. This step is incredibly important, and I think is the most important step in making sure that the R and the D are in agreement or have a common understanding at the very least every step of the way. And then finally make the decision. The recommender writes up a recommendation, and the decider picks it. Or if they don't pick it, they need to offer criteria to suggest a different recommendation. So this was just one example of a framework for making technical decisions or decisions at large. Hopefully this was a clear case study for how we applied this approach to choosing a front-end framework for development on our new learning environment. And I talked about 3 roles today, the decider, the recommender, and the inputter roles. I've seen those 3 roles exist within one person. That can get a little bit confusing at times, and I've seen it exist across a team of 5 or 6 people. And the whole point is that by being clear about those roles, it doesn't necessarily need to be one person who has each, but it needs to be clear on what are the responsibilities for each of those roles and to whom do they belong. So that's it. Hopefully that's a good overview for everyone who's watching. I'm going to switch on over to Q&A, and Ed, you want to take it away?
Wonderful presentation there, Ryan. It was great. Very, very interesting framework for making decisions. And we've got a bunch of stuff to talk about here. So we've done some polls while you've been presenting, and let's go to the results of those polls right now. So, first poll: has Codecademy ever helped you learn to code? 236 said yes, 192 no. So most of our audience has learned something from Codecademy, which is pretty cool.
Awesome.
So that's a testament to the impact you've made in the world, especially as part of the Code Year project that you launched last year. That was phenomenal. How many developers learned to code out of that project?
Overall on codeyear.com?
Yeah.
That entire initiative, I mean, over 1 million people participated at some point over the year. I had a hard time tracking every single one of them down, but it was an incredible experience for us, and it was incredible to see the response that it got. And I think, just going to this conference today, it's incredible to see how many people are interested in all the different topics that we're talking about. So it's clear that this really is an awesome movement.
Yeah, you are doing it, man. I mean, like that Code Year initiative. I mean, 1 million people learning to code. There's a projected $500 billion shortfall in wages for jobs for programmers by 2020. And you were helping to bridge that gap through Code Year. So definitely admire your work there.
Thank you. I think with Hack Hands, you're certainly helping out as well.
Thanks. We're trying our best. So next poll question here is, how much time did your worst development decision cost you? Most people think it cost them days, but there are some people who said it took them months and that they're still dealing with it.
Yeah, my biggest takeaway is that it's certainly not minutes and hours. It's incredibly important, and truth be told, I'm not even sure how most people learn how to make good technical decisions. It was something that maybe you learn from the School of Hard Knocks. You realize after feeling enough pain that you better take a moment and figure it out. Or maybe someone's in on a secret that I'm not quite so sure about. But I did think that this was one of the most important and impactful conversations that I could talk about to an audience of thousands of aspiring to accomplished software engineers.
Absolutely. Okay, so now, how did you primarily learn to code? Most people are self-taught. Some learned in college, some took online training. And then finally, does your organization document its decision-making process, Overwhelmingly, no. Only I'd say about maybe 15% or so of the audience.
Maybe you should ask a follow-up question, and do you agree with that? So I'm not sure.
All right, I will ask that question. Do you agree? How do you want me to phrase the question? I'll phrase it exactly.
Do you wish your organization documents its decision-making process? No, yes, and it already does. I'm curious. I'm making an assumption that it's incredibly important. To me, I've seen the value of clear, effective documentation, and I know engineers live this every day. I don't think, whether you're building a framework or you're deciding which one to use, in one case you might be writing hundreds of pages, or at least creating hundreds of pages of code examples and documentation. And the other, at the very least, it deserves a page.
Well, there you go. We've got real-time votes already.
Yeah, this is great.
28 people, sorry, 32 people, 36.
By Q&A, I just meant I'm going to be asking the audience questions. I guess they're not going to ask me questions.
Now over 60 people have said yes, that they wish their company documented their decision-making process.
Yeah.
Only 10 people so far said no. So it looks like
if you're a team of 3 people, team of 5 people, or you don't need it, I'm saying it's not for everyone, absolutely. But.
Yeah, it looks like you're pretty convincing. Now I have a question before we jump into the audience questions. My question is kind of a weird question.
Sure.
So there's this book that I love called The 1 Minute Manager, and in that book it talks about the idea of coupling authority with responsibility. The idea that if you want to really empower the culture of your organization to succeed, then you really have to hand off the decision-making authority and power to those who are entrusted with the responsibility of executing on those decisions. How do you think that the decision-maker framework of divorcing the recommender and the decider and the inputs, how do you think that that dovetails with that philosophy of empowering decision-makers with authority plus responsibility together?
I don't think there's actually a contradiction there. The reason why is because the decider is, in most cases, the person who has, they're going to feel the most impact from the decision in theory because they can hold the accountability of the decision, right? And in turn, they might be the most biased actually in making the decision. They might not be willing to take a risk. They might be afraid to try something new, or they might have whatever other bias in the process, right? I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge that up front and to highlight that they have full input in the process, they have full input in the criteria. They ultimately get to veto the recommendation, but it is the recommender who has the authority or ultimate responsibility of putting together a recommendation. I think when you look at, when you try to combine all of those responsibilities into one person, it's very easy to get muddied in your thinking and your argument very quickly.
You're saying because of the bias inherent.
Because there's so many factors and considerations in play, right? Let's say you need to make a decision that might put the engineering team's effectiveness or productivity on the line, right? The person who's making that decision may not have actual best benefits of the product team or the engineering team at heart because they may want to not take any risks. They may want to keep things going as usual because that's what they understand, that's what they're comfortable, that's what they know. But there is someone else on the team who is really, really excited about trying something entirely different. And in one case, it might be totally appropriate. In another case, it might not be. And the whole point of this framework is to put all of that out on the table and to force those conversations. I think it's much better to make that tension explicit than to make it implicit or just ignore it outright and not include it in the framework to call it out.
Makes total sense. I mean, what I hear you saying here is that some decisions are so profound and important for the organization that the individual impact that it may make on a team and the personal biases that may result in that may not be what's best for the company.
That's a great summary. Or at least the team at large, yeah.
Okay, great. Let's go to some of these audience questions.
Awesome.
The number one question asked by Raymond Gonzalez. So Raymond, in exchange for you asking the question that has 130 votes, you will be winning a 1-hour free mentoring session through Hack.pledge with the participating speaker of your choice. Ryan is one of those signatories, and so we'll be in touch after the event is over in 2015 to connect you with the mentor of your choice. For the rest of you who don't know, this is an initiative for developers to mentor each other for 1 hour in the year 2015 to help improve the quality of software development around the world, to improve software development productivity, and to bridge the gap between good and great programmers, and to also, as a side product, help improve diversity among programmers who may not have access to mentors in their local communities. So Raymond's question here is, why doesn't Codecademy have Java or C++? And do you plan on creating a Codecademy for children?
Yeah, absolutely. Raymond, congrats on the top question. And I'm going to reframe that a bit to a slightly different question, which is how do we think about curriculum and the curriculum that we teach on Codecademy? Because you kind of have two questions buried in there at once. We try to teach the most relevant and also complete skill sets possible that we think tie to jobs in programming space. And it's an incredibly large industry. There's a wide variety of jobs across the spectrum, everything from jobs to maintain legacy code or existing code bases to programming across thousands of platforms and also thousands of different business domains. So we do have to be decisive. We can't create a curriculum for everyone. So we do try to pick the best kind of onboarding ramp for programming. That means that we're not necessarily going to pick some languages over others if we think that they might be harder to learn or they're not necessarily your best first language. And at the same time, we're going to focus on creating content for users who are in one way or another interested in getting a job as a programmer. So children are well on their way possibly to that future, and I've seen 5 to 18-year-olds do amazing things at all different stages and ages. We're not at the moment trying to build a curriculum for kids. I think initiatives like Code.org, Tinker, Scratch, they do an amazing job of kind of boiling down some of the basic principles of logic, flow, and basic programming principles like variables and iteration into either a visual interface or into a different problem domain like storytelling. But at the end of the day, there is a pretty wide gap between, I think, that approach to teaching programming and teaching skills that directly connect to jobs in the marketplace.
Makes sense. Next question. We only have a couple more minutes here. What are the top 3 future goals for Codecademy?
Yeah, Christian, I actually saw this question when I started. I think it's been up here for about 8 or 10 hours, and I was actually really happy to see it because it was really exciting. When I think about what we could do with Codecademy as a product and as a community and a platform, currently I boil it down to one goal, which is to build a product that can be the best pathway for an absolute beginner into an entry-level developer position. In order to do that, there's probably more than 3 goals as part of that, but to say 2 others, that's to build a product platform that can do that, but it's also to build a community of learners who can help each other on that way, or on that pathway. And we've have come a really long way in all 3 of those initiatives, but we're not there yet, and that's what we're working towards.
And then I think we have time for this one last question.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of is, I guess, it may have been asked a little bit earlier because later that you were on Backbone about do you consider these JavaScript frameworks. I think maybe a twist on that question that I'll ask you here is, what was your kind of sense of Angular.js versus Backbone in that context? How did that decision arrive?
So in the decision to choose a front-end framework, how did we compare Angular, Backbone, and React?
Yeah.
They each have very different design philosophies. I think once you come to understand your use case, it's clear which one's best. They try to do different things and or at least fit into different parts of the stack. Angular is absolutely kind of a full stack, very opinionated framework. It was hard for us to figure out how to fit something like Angular into our current application architecture. Backbone we were already using, and we were really happy, and it's designed to handle kind of the model and the controller level of logic and frameworks. The view portion of that, I don't think it tries to claim to do it well, and things can get really hairy. And React, it tries to be the view layer of your application and to handle all of the logic that's involved with that in a performant and elegant way. So they're very different, with very different architecture goals and designs. And once you understand that, and then once you understand your use case, it should be pretty obvious which one's best for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that point you just made here about we already knew Backbone is critical, because a lot of entrepreneurs come to me for advice about what technology should I use for my new startup. And what I always tell them is whatever your chief technology officer prefers, because these are all just tools that get you to the end. And what matters the most is just getting it going. So I thought that's the very wise criteria there.
Yeah, or at the very least, the CTO is responsible for it. So if it's a bad choice, it's on his back or her back.
Exactly. Great, Ryan. Very, very grateful for your participation. It was a fantastic talk. I learned a lot.
Thank you for having me. This was
Absolutely.
great.
Now, for the audience members here, if you enjoyed what Ryan had to say today, please consider donating to one of the 16 nonprofits, which you can see right now in the tab highlighted called Get Involved. And you can also sign the pledge there, so you can receive 1 hour of free mentoring in 2015. If you're ever stuck programming, you can get unstuck that way. You can also give an hour of mentoring to help another programmer in need. Ryan, thanks again. It's great having you here today.
Yeah, Ed, thank you for having me.
Great. Have a great day. We'll see you guys soon at the next speaker. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes.